So my name is Greg Caruso. I am director of the Patrick J. Waide Center for Applied Ethics here at Fairfield University. And someone was raising their hand. Let me just,
Mhm.
okay, participants. All right, hopefully that was by accident. Um, so this is part of the Waide Center for Applied Ethics seminar series here at Fairfield University. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to the Waide Center, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker for this evening, Jeff Sabo. And just to tell people a little bit about the format, the speaker will generally go for around 45 minutes, and then there'll be a period of question and answer that will last roughly about 45 minutes, and we will wrap up probably close to 5:30, if not a couple minutes early. Unfortunately, we won't be able to see you when you ask questions, but if you use the raise hand function, I can unmute you and you can ask your question to the speaker. Or if you feel more comfortable, you can also type your question into the chat and I will just read it to the guest. Um, just a word or two about the Waide Center for Applied Ethics. Here at Fairfield University, we advance learning, research, and dialogue about the leading ethical issues of our time. The center has three core missions: curriculum, research, and outreach. So we offer applied ethics courses across the university on ethical issues in various fields, including business ethics, environmental ethics, AI ethics, um, engineering ethics, and a whole host of other applied ethics courses. We sponsor research conducted by students, faculty, and practitioners, and we organize and facilitate programs that serve both the college community, the university body, and also the larger community. And the seminar series is part of that outreach. The goal of this series is to build community and advance research in applied ethics. We encourage accessible, sort of jargon-free, supportive discussions that will be accessible to participants with an interest in applied ethics, but who may come from different disciplines or backgrounds. And one of the benefits of the series is that we allow half of the session to devote it to question and answer for general discussion. Okay, so I'm very excited today to introduce Jeff Sabo from New York University. The title of his talk is going to be The Moral Circle, and that's also a title of his recent book, which I own and have read, and it's an excellent book, so I'm very excited for tonight's talk. Jeff has a lot of titles, and so I just will introduce him with some of those titles, but he's the Associate Professor of Environmental Studies, Affiliated Professor of Bioethics, Medical Ethics, Philosophy, and Law, Director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, Director of the Center for Mine Ethics and Policy, and co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program at New York University. His research focuses on animal mines, ethics and policy, AI mines, ethics and policy, and global health and climate ethics and policy. He's the author of The Moral Circle, as I mentioned, but also author of Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, and co-author of Chimpanzees' Rights and Food, Animals, and the Environment. He's also a board member at Minding Animals International, an advisory board member at the Intersect Welfare Research Society, and a senior affiliate at the Institute for Law and AI. In 2024, Vox included him on its Future Perfect 50s list of thinkers, innovators, and change makers who are working to make the future a better place. Very excited to introduce today Jeff Sabo. Thank you, Jeff.
Well, thank you for introducing me and inviting me to be here today. Thanks everybody for being here. We have a great turnout. Really looking forward to the conversation with you. And yes, as Greg
Sure.
mentioned, I'm going to tell you about my book, The Moral Circle, and about some of the information and arguments and recommendations contained in that book. And the idea of the moral circle is that we want to think about what are the boundaries, what are the contours of our moral community? To whom do we have moral responsibilities? To whom are we accountable when we make decisions, when we develop policies? Obviously, for much of human history, we have had a quite narrow conception of the moral circle, especially in the West, but to some degree all over the world. And that has meant mainly extending moral consideration to some members of our own species, maybe every now and then the occasional charismatic companion animal. But that has meant largely entirely neglecting the interests, needs, vulnerabilities of the vast majority of stakeholders of our actions. Now, we now recognize, at least many of us do, that this has been a mistake and that we, in fact, should expand our moral circle. We should consider at least all humans affected by our activity and many non-human animals affected by our activity. For example, mammals and birds and other animals who are clearly sentient and agentic. In other words, they have the capacity to experience pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering and to set and pursue their own goals by acting on their own desires and preferences. And so we recognize now that when we make decisions, when we develop policies, we should consider the interests, the needs, the vulnerabilities of humans who will be affected, of at least mammals and birds and other sentient agentic animals who will be affected. Now, that is clearly still a work in progress. We should still be doing and can easily still be doing much more to improve the well-being of humans affected by our activities, especially mammals and birds affected by our activities. For example, we still factory farm tens of billions of mammals and birds every year, often unnecessarily, especially as we have plant-based options available. We also fail to consider them in our infrastructure and transportation systems, and that leads to a lot of collisions. So we still have a lot of work to do, even to treat with all due respect and compassion those who we now recognize are included in our moral circle. But as we do that work, as we try to make that progress, we also have an opportunity to ask, should we go farther still? Should we aspire at least to include even a larger number and wider range of beings in our moral circle? And in my book and in my talk today, I will argue that yes, we should expand our moral circle much faster, much farther, even than many philosophers think. In particular, I believe that we should extend at least some moral consideration now to all vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and many invertebrates, cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, even insects like ants and bees, of whom there are an estimated quintillion plus alive at any given time, and some near future AI systems. Maybe not current generation AI systems, but the kinds that plausibly will exist within the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. I believe that right now we should extend at least some moral consideration to all of those categories, all vertebrates, many invertebrates, and even some near future AI systems. And so what I will do in this talk is first of all explain why I think we should extend at least some consideration to all of these entities, as well as what it would involve to assess their interests and prepare appropriate policies and procedures for making decisions that affect them. But then, second of all, consider what would follow for our lives and societies, our practices, our policies, our priorities, our presumption of human exceptionalism, this idea that we always come first, we always matter the most, we always deserve priority, both individually and collectively. And I will suggest that in a world with such a vast number and wide range of potentially morally significant beings with whom we interact, over whom we exercise power, we are not able to sustain our presumption of human exceptionalism. We will have to acknowledge that there are at least some circumstances where non humans should come first, where they should be regarded as having higher stakes, mattering more, deserving priority. And I will suggest that the challenge is to recognize the significance of these populations, but then also the difficulty of caring for these populations sustainably in equal measure. And once we recognize both of those ideas in equal measure, the importance, the significance, but also the complexity, the difficulty, then we can find a productive way forward. Okay, so as a starting point, why should we extend at least some moral consideration to such a vast number and such a wide range of non-humans, especially when we can barely get it together to take care of 8 billion members of one species we happen to care about? Well, I think that we should extend at least some consideration to these beings because for me, the question is not, do they definitely morally matter? And the question is not even, do they probably morally matter? The question is instead simply, is there a realistic, non negligible, non trivial chance that they morally matter based on the best information and arguments presently available to us? And I think if the answer to that question is yes, if there is at least a realistic, non negligible, non trivial chance that they matter, then we have a responsibility to at least consider some welfare risk for them in the spirit of caution and humility as we seek to learn more. And I think that because this is a classic case of high stakes decision making involving risk and uncertainty. This issue is important and this issue is difficult, and we are going to have to make decisions without knowing for sure what exactly the boundaries of the moral circle ought to be. And that calls for the same types of tools for decision making involving risk and uncertainty that we apply in other domains. And I can explain what that means. So the issue is important, first of all, because we share the world with a vast number and wide range of non human beings. We exercise power over them, and it can be both easy and harmful to make mistakes about whether they morally matter. And that can be true in both directions. It can be easy and harmful to over attribute moral significance to them. It can be easy and harmful to perceive them and treat them as though they are sentient and agentic and otherwise morally significant, even when they are not. We are especially likely to do that when non-humans look like us and act like us, and when we classify them as companions. This is already happening, for example, with present day chatbots that generate realistic language just based on pattern matching and text prediction. This is such a realistic performance, such an incredible role playing exercise that these models are doing, that we have trouble seeing them as objects. We really do see them as subjects and feel drawn towards caring for them and being in relationships with them. And this can be benign in many cases, but it can also be harmful in many cases. It can lead us to form inappropriate social and emotional bonds with these non-humans. It can even lead us to misallocate scarce resources towards them that would be better spent on humans and mammals and birds and other animals who really need them. It can even lead us to make inappropriate sacrifices for them or because of them, as with several tragic cases where people harmed themselves because of their interactions with chatbots, allegedly, at least. At the same time, it can also be easy to under attribute moral significance to non humans, to perceive them and treat them as lacking sentience and agency and moral significance, even when they have them. This can be especially easy when they look different from us, when they act different from us, and when we classify them as commodities, as of course we do right now still with many non human animals, even mammals and birds that we all on reflection recognize are sentient, agentic, morally significant. And this is especially a risk with fishes or insects who are used in the farming industry or in other industries. We are especially prone to seeing and treating them as objects. And this can, of course, be harmful because it can lead to systematic exploitation and extermination of vulnerable populations against their will, often for trivial purposes, often even when we have alternatives available to us that would be just as good, if not better, for us. So, this is a situation, unfortunately, where there is risk in both directions, where mistakes can be both easy and costly and harmful in both directions. And we can debate which risk is worse in a given situation. But for right now, the present point is simply that because risks are easy and harmful in both directions, that means there is no easy, obvious, straightforward, universal way to err on the side of caution when we are trying to decide whether to treat a particular non human entity as though it matters morally, as though it is sentient, agentic, morally significant. We might have no choice but to assess the evidence and assess the arguments and make the best judgment available to us given the best available evidence and arguments. But unfortunately, the issue is also difficult because these questions about the sentience and agency and moral significance of non-humans, they touch on some of the hardest problems in science and philosophy with respect to both values and facts. We have ongoing expert and public disagreement and uncertainty, both about ethics, what it takes to matter morally, to deserve respect and compassion and consideration, and about science, about which beings have the relevant properties or stand with us in the relevant relationships. So, for example, on the ethics side, we still have ongoing expert and public disagreement and uncertainty about what it takes to matter. Do you need to be sentient, capable of consciously experiencing positive and negative states like pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering? Or is it enough to be conscious without being sentient, to be capable of having feelings, even if they lack a positive and negative valence? Or is it enough to be agentic without being conscious, to be able to set and pursue your own goals in a self directed manner, even if it feels like nothing at all to be you? Philosophers disagree about that. Philosophers are uncertain about that. And there are other options to consider too. And then on the science side, we still have ongoing expert and public disagreement and uncertainty about who has what it takes. For example, in order to be conscious, in order to be capable of having feelings, emotions, subjective experiences of any kind, do you need a brain with the exact materials and structures and functions as a human or mammalian or avian brain? Or is it enough to have any cognitive system with broadly analogous capacities for perception and attention and learning and memory and self awareness and social awareness and flexible decision making? Maybe a global workspace that integrates it all together to coordinate activity. Or is it enough to have even a simpler cognitive system, any type of system that can minimally process information or represent objects in the environment? Philosophers and scientists still disagree about that. They still have uncertainty about that. And once again, there are other options too. And this disagreement, this uncertainty, this confusion about the nature of moral status and about the nature of consciousness, for example, is not going anywhere anytime soon. It is not as though we are on the cusp of a secure theory of moral status or a secure theory of consciousness about which we can have anything approaching consensus or certainty. Our fundamental predicament is that we are one kind of mind coexisting with and making decisions that affect many, many, many other kinds of minds without knowing for sure what, if anything, it feels like to be those minds and whether, if at all, those minds morally matter. And we are going to have to make decisions about whether to include them in the moral circle without being able to resolve these questions. We can make progress on them, but we are not going to have certainty. Now, this is a classic case of high stakes, important decision making involving risk and uncertainty. And that calls for caution and humility. And when a situation calls for caution and humility, that means that we should exercise some care here. We should not wait for certainty about whether someone is sentient or agentic or otherwise morally significant before taking basic steps to mitigate risks that we might be imposing on them. In general, if there is a realistic, non negligible, non trivial chance that our actions or policies are causing harm, then we should take reasonable, proportionate steps to consider and mitigate those risks when deciding what to do. We do this all the time. Even in our own personal lives, we will consider a 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that a medicine will cause a fatal side effect before we decide whether to take that medicine. We do it in public health and environmental policy when deciding how to navigate risks involving emerging pathogens or risks involving catastrophic climate change. We do it with AI safety when developing and deploying these increasingly sophisticated AI systems. We are going to want to put some safeguards on these activities, not because they definitely will cause catastrophic harm, and not even because they probably will cause catastrophic harm. If there is even, again, 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that the further development and deployment of AI will cause catastrophic harm for humans and other animals, that should at least be one factor among many in decisions about whether and how to scale up this technology. And what I am suggesting is we ought to apply that same basic type of risk analysis to our thinking about the moral circle and our thinking about which beings to consider when making decisions that affect them. In the same way that we should not wait for certainty about whether AI will cause catastrophic harm before taking basic precautionary measures, we should also not wait for certainty about whether, for example, insects or AI systems are capable of suffering before taking basic precautionary measures. If, according to the best evidence and arguments available, there is at least, say, a 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that an insect or an AI system could experience even flickers of their own versions of pleasure and pain, then that should likewise be at least one factor among many in decisions about how to treat these individuals. And that is what I mean when I say we should extend at least some moral consideration to all vertebrates, many invertebrates, and some near future AI systems. I am not saying that they definitely are sentient, agentic, otherwise morally significant. I am not even saying that they probably are sentient, agentic, otherwise morally significant. I am instead saying that there is at least a realistic, non negligible, non trivial 1 in 1,000 chance that they are sentient, agentic, or otherwise morally significant based on the best evidence and arguments available. And that means we should give at least some consideration to these beings. We should treat our effects on them as at least one small factor among many in decisions about how to treat them. And that might at least be enough to avoid causing massive and unnecessary harm on them for trivial reasons. Now, how can we go about assessing whether a given entity does have a realistic, non negligible, non trivial chance of mattering morally, of being sentient, agentic, otherwise morally significant? Well, we unfortunately are not very good at doing this because we only have one kind of mind. We have only one kind of experience. And that makes it very difficult to know for sure what, if anything, it feels like to be anyone else. But we do have some tools, a certain kind of methodology that we can use to collect evidence and make at least rough probability estimates. And so I can tell you a little bit about this methodology, and I can tell you a little bit about what it shows us in the case of animals and AI systems. So the methodology is called the marker or indicator methodology. And the way that it works is that we can start by looking inward. We can start by introspecting, and we can think about what is happening in my body, what is happening in my brain, my nervous system, when I have experiences like pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering? What behaviors do I perform? What are my brain's and body's internal reactions? And then I can look for broadly similar behavioral profiles and broadly similar anatomical or physiological properties in non-humans of various kinds. So, for example, behaviorally with other animals, I can ask questions like, do they nurse their own wounds? Do they respond to analgesics and antidepressants in the same ways that we do? Do they make thoughtful behavioral trade offs between the avoidance of noxious stimuli and the pursuit of other valuable goals like food or water or a nice new shell? And that is in addition to looking kind of under the hood and asking anatomically, physiologically, do they have the same kind of brain and central nervous system as me? Do they have pain receptors? And does that allow them to interact with the environment in the same way as I do? Now, if we find these features in non human animals, that is not proof that they are sentient or otherwise morally significant. Proof is unavailable in the absence of a secure theory of sentience about which we can all agree. But it does count as evidence. It counts as at least a little bit of evidence under uncertainty. It ticks the probability up at least a little bit under uncertainty. If I go to a non-human animal and I find, oh wow, they do actually have a lot of the same behaviors as me when I feel pain, and they do actually have a lot of the same stuff under the hood as me when I feel pain, that at least makes them a little bit more likely to be sentient by my lights than they were before I started paying attention to this evidence. And that can still be better than nothing when we need to make high stakes decisions under uncertainty. Now, with AI, we are not able to look for behaviors in quite the same way or treat them as evidence in quite the same way because, first of all, AI systems did not co evolve with us in the same evolutionary environment, facing the same evolutionary pressures as non human animals. Also, we know that many AI systems were specifically designed to mimic human behavior. And so that means that if an AI system acts like a human, or even if an AI system uses human language and reason and tells you, I am conscious, I deserve welfare protections and rights, or if they say, I am not conscious, I do not deserve welfare protections and rights, none of that is particularly good evidence, one way or the other, about whether this AI system might, in fact, have feelings or emotions or deserve moral consideration on their own, in their own right. But we might be able to work towards the development of AI systems whose behavior would count as better evidence in the future. And in the meantime, we can still look under the hood and search for architectural computational equivalents of the kinds of perception and attention and learning and memory and self-awareness and social awareness and so on and so forth that, according to a wide range of leading scientific theories of sentience and consciousness, are in fact what lies underneath our sentience and consciousness. And again, if we found all of that, if we found the same behaviors that we perform when we stub our toe, if we found the same underlying structural and functional properties performing those behaviors, that would not be proof of sentience, moral significance. That is still unavailable without a secure theory of sentience. But it once again at least counts as evidence. If I go look at a chatbot or a robot, and I find not only are they producing realistic language, but they are producing it by using the same exact internal types of structures and functions that human and animal brains use. And the only difference is that our brains are made out of meat and these brains are made out of metal. Well, that would tick the probability up a little bit. It would make them a little bit more likely to be sentient by my lights than when I first started investigating the matter. And so, what do we find when we start looking for these types of markers or indicators with animals and AI systems? Well, with non human animals, we are still pretty early in our search because keep in mind, there are quintillions of individuals spread across millions of species, and we have studied only a very, very tiny fraction of these species. But when we go looking, we do tend to find at least some evidence. 50 years ago, a lot of experts assumed that only humans are sentient, conscious, able to have feelings and emotions. Then we started studying other primates, and people grudgingly started accepting the evidence of primate sentience and consciousness as pretty overwhelming. Then we started studying other mammals and birds, and people grudgingly acknowledged that, okay, the evidence is pretty strong there too. But by the turn of the century, there was still a lot of resistance to the idea that sentience and consciousness goes beyond the mammals and the birds and maybe a select few additional animals. But now we have been making a more of an active effort to examine a much wider range of non-human animals. And when we examine a much wider range of animals with species appropriate tests and with an open mind, we do find that they have many of the relevant behaviors and many of the relevant anatomical properties. And that includes all vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and many invertebrates, the ones I mentioned before, cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, even insects like ants and bees. They all display some clear markers or indicators of sentience, like nursing their wounds or responding to analgesics or antidepressants or making behavioral trade offs of various kinds in a way that shows that they integrate information. Even small animals with small brains are quite adept at performing many of these tasks. And as I said before, that is not proof of anything, but it does call for a little bit of curiosity, a little bit of humility, a little bit of open mindedness. And I think it easily meets the bar for at least a 1 in 1,000 chance that it feels like something to be them. And so I do think that we ought to give them at least some consideration when making decisions that affect them as we seek to learn more. And actually, in 2024, we brought together leading scientists from all over the world for a conference at New York University where we collectively expressed this idea in what is now known as the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. Scientists from all over the world expressed that the current evidence now supports attributions of consciousness to mammals and birds, and at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in all vertebrates and cephalopod, mollusks, decapod crustaceans, and insects. And the declaration also noted that if there is at least a realistic chance of consciousness in an animal, it would be irresponsible to simply treat them as an object when making decisions that affect them. We should give them at least some consideration, extend at least some concern to them out of an abundance of caution. Now, what about AI? When we look at AI, I am here to tell you, and you can rest easy. We are not yet finding the same level of evidence of sentience and consciousness that we find when we look at even ants and bees in the animal kingdom. Um, we are instead seeing that they are producing many impressive behaviors, but those behaviors are plausibly still best explained by pattern matching and text prediction that can seem very realistic, but is a result of a kind of training and algorithm. Um, and then when we look under the hood, we are starting to see very early versions of capacities like perception and attention, certainly learning and memory and language, and now some decision making capabilities, but we are not yet seeing those as fully fleshed out as they are in humans and other animals, or as fully integrated with each other as they are in humans and other animals. At the same time, you should not be too relieved here. You should not be too uh, satisfied to indefinitely treat AI systems as objects, because there is no, as far as we can tell, in principle technical barrier to the creation of AI systems that do have advanced and integrated versions of all of these capacities, including in the near future. We know that AI companies and governments are racing to create artificial general intelligence. And we know that while consciousness and intelligence are technically different, one is about having feelings, the other is about thinking. They do share many of the same underlying conditions, according to a wide range of leading theories of consciousness and intelligence. The more AI systems do have advanced and integrated capacities for perception and attention and learning and memory and so on and so forth, the likelier they will be to be generally intelligent, and the likelier they will be to be conscious in their own way, as far as we can tell. And so, even if AI companies are not specifically trying to build AI systems that can have their own feelings and emotions, we may find that at some point, some company accidentally, without even realizing it, does create such a system in the pursuit of general intelligence, much in the same way that evolution accidentally, without realizing it, created conscious humans and other animals in the course of trying to increase our fitness, our ability to survive and reproduce. So, with AI, I am not saying, as I am with animals, that there is a realistic chance that they morally matter and deserve respect and compassion now. I am, however, saying that when we consider the path and the pace, the trajectory of AI development, and when we consider ongoing disagreement and uncertainty about sentience and consciousness and moral status, and when we consider that technological change is often much faster than our social, legal, political responses, that should make us think, first of all, that there is a realistic chance that they will morally matter and deserve some moral consideration within the next 5, 10, 15 years. And second of all, if that is true, then we should be taking at least basic steps to prepare for that possibility right now. And so in a report that we published last year called Taking AI Welfare Seriously, a collaborative report, we make this case and we argue that AI companies have a responsibility to right now take three basic steps. First, acknowledge that this is a credible and legitimate issue. This is not just a science fiction issue or an issue only for the far future. this is at least potentially an issue for the near future. And that makes it an issue to be thinking somewhat about today. Second, they should start assessing their systems for welfare relevant features, adapting the kinds of welfare assessment tools that we have developed for animal welfare in the way that I have described. And third, they should prepare policies and procedures for treating AI systems with an appropriate level of moral concern when the time comes in a way that strikes a balance that balances the risks involving over attribution and under attribution. Now, fortunately, since we released that report, some good work has happened in the space. It was about a year ago that we released this report in November 2024. On the day we released it, the AI company Anthropic acknowledged to the media that they had hired one of the authors of the report, Kyle Fish, as their first full time AI welfare, model welfare researcher. They then, in spring 2025, announced a full model welfare program that would research, investigate the possibility of consciousness or moral significance in AI systems. They also included early initial proof of concept model welfare assessments in their Claude 4 system card. And they even implemented an intervention over the summer, which involves allowing Claude, their language model, to exit harmful or abusive conversations for both AI safety and AI welfare reasons. Some Google researchers are now working on the topic as well. Two Google researchers have a book coming out. OpenAI is starting to study at least seemingly conscious AI so that they can understand over attribution risks. And so the space is expanding, but we still might have only a limited amount of time before the evidence accumulates. And there really is a decent chance that some AI systems matter in their own way. So the clock is ticking, and I think we need to make more progress faster if we want to be prepared to be able to react thoughtfully when the time comes instead of being caught flat footed. Okay, so that is why I think any honest assessment of the current evidence and arguments suggests that there is at least a realistic, non negligible, non trivial chance that a vast number and wide range of non humans matter for their own sakes. And again, that includes all vertebrates, many invertebrates, and some near future AI systems. And why we have a responsibility to extend them at least a little bit of consideration, treat our effects on them as at least one factor among many when making decisions that affect them. Now, with our remaining time, with the about 15 minutes that I have left before we start having a conversation and see where you want to take the conversation, I would like to think a little bit about what follows from this rapid moral circle expansion for our lives and societies, for our practices, our priorities, our presumption of human exceptionalism. And as I said before, I want to suggest that we are unfortunately going to need to challenge our presumption of human exceptionalism, acknowledge that we might not always matter the most, we might not always take priority. And then I will try to reassure you that that is not the end of the world. That is actually a situation to be welcomed, not one to be feared. So you might think, okay, even if I accept for the sake of discussion that we should extend at least some moral consideration to such a vast number and such a wide range of non humans, well, we can still matter more. If our interests ever conflict with theirs, we should favor our interests and we should minimize their interests. We should discount their interests. And I can get why that would be a tempting thought. One might think that for capacities reasons and relational and practical reasons. And I can explain what I mean, but then explain why this will only go so far towards vindicating human exceptionalism. So, in terms of capacities reasons, humans are quite remarkable creatures. We do stand out in various ways, and that can include we have big brains and long lifespans, a lot of neurons, and really complex nervous systems. And that means we can experience quite intense and prolonged pleasures and pains and forms of happiness and suffering. We also have remarkable agentic capabilities. I can not only pursue goals, but I can make life plans that span decades. I can decide to go to college and then grad school and then become a philosophy professor and then teach people about ethics. And that is not a form of planning that non-human animals appear to be capable of, even if they can, for example, push a box across the room and then stand on top of it to get a banana. So, if, for example, a house is burning down and you have time to save either me or a worm, but not both, well, it makes sense that you would break the tie in favor of saving me without being speciesist, because there is plausibly more at stake for me than there is for the worm. If I died in the fire, I would probably experience more intense suffering than the worm. If I survived the fire, I would probably have more years of more intense happiness available to me than the worm. And so you could break the tie in favor of saving me, not because you were being speciesist and just preferring humans as such, but rather because you realize more happiness and suffering is at stake over here than over here. And that means the stakes are higher over here, and you can break the tie that way. Fair enough, fair enough. But even if you think that we can generally prioritize, say, a human over a worm because we have more complex brains and longer lifespans, and so the stakes are generally higher for us in a given situation, please keep in mind that that might not always justify prioritizing humans over other animals. We might not always have the most complex brains. African elephants have 3 times as many neurons as humans, for example. Immortal jellyfishes have much longer natural lifespans than humans, for example. So if these individuals matter, there are at least some dimensions along which they trump us. And in the future, highly advanced AI systems, well, they could have more complex brains and longer lifespans. And so, if they were sentient in their own way, they could potentially have more intense and prolonged experiences than we do, in the same way that we have more intense and prolonged experiences than worms do. And all of that is true about agency as well. I might be able to make more ambitious life plans than a worm, but in the future, an advanced AI system might be able to make more advanced life plans than me. And by the way, even if I do outnumber one non-human animal, I might not outnumber many. And even if we collectively, 8 billion humans, outnumber 8 billion worms or ants, we might not collectively outweigh all of the many non-human animals in the world combined. Again, there are about 8 billion of us, there are quintillions of them. And so even if a given human matters a million or 2 or 3 or 4 million times as much as the average non-human animal, all of them combined might still trump all of us combined. So when we think about capacities and when we think about stakes, that might justify prioritizing humans in some 1-to-1 comparisons or even 1-to-5 comparisons. But it is not going to be a blanket justification from an impartial perspective for prioritizing our species over all of the other types of potentially morally significant individuals combined. But now you might say, well, morality was never about impartial considerations only. It was always partly about partial considerations too. It was always partly about relational factors and practical factors. For example, I have a right, maybe even a responsibility, to prioritize my family over other families. I ought to consider other families, but I should care for my family first before I care for other families. I should ensure that my family has food and water and shelter and affection on a daily basis. And I do not owe that level of sustained care to all of the other families of the world. And that is not because my family, from an impartial perspective, matters more, has more at stake than all of the other families combined. We know that is not the case. The reason I should care for my family first is simply because they are my family. I relate to them in this very special way. I have this special history and relationship with them, and that confers certain special responsibilities of care. There are also practical reasons why I should care for my family more than I should care for other families. First of all, I know them very well. I know exactly what they need and I know how to provide that for them. And this is not the case with many other humans. I also have an ability to care for them. I live in the same place as them. They are right here and they exist in small enough numbers that I can sustain providing food and water and shelter for them on a daily basis. And that is not true of all of the other humans in the world combined. And by the way, my family and I, we need to care for each other in order to be able to care for other families in a sustainable way. And those relational and practical factors, one might think, those support caring for our species above other species in a similar way. Even if other species matter more than we do from an impartial perspective, we should still think of humanity as a kind of big family and regard ourselves as having a special history with each other and special relationship with each other. And that might confer a special duty of care to our fellow humans. Additionally, those practical factors matter too. We know more about how to care for fellow humans than most other animals. We have more of an ability to care for fellow humans than we have to care for most other animals in terms of resources and infrastructure and institutions. And we need to care for each other as a species in order to collectively be able to sustain any measure of support for other species. So we might think that is why we should prioritize ourselves, not because we impartially matter more, we don't, but rather because for a combination of relational and practical reasons, we need to take care of each other in order to be able to take care of others. We owe that to each other and we owe that to others. Now, I think that is a pretty good set of considerations, but I think it only takes us so far. Because again, we can have special relationships with other animals too. There is no human in the world that matters more to me than my dog Smokey. My dog Smokey is the most important individual in the world, with apologies to my partner and my parents and my brother and Greg and everybody else. And I'm sorry, but that is the way it is. And I think a lot of other humans have special relationships with non-human animals in a similar way. Also, affection, bonds of care are not the only type of morally significant relationship there is. If I harm someone, that generates a relational responsibility too. Now I have to reduce and repair the harm that I caused because of my history of harming this individual. And that is a kind of relationship that, whether we like it or not, we stand in with a huge number of non-human animals because of agriculture, deforestation, development, the wildlife trade, circulating diseases, human caused climate change. Our actions are now touching animals everywhere, whether we like it or not. And that does generate a relational responsibility to reduce and repair the harms of human activity. And so when we consider the relational privilege that humans might deserve because of our affection for them, with the relational privilege that non humans might deserve because of the enormous scale of harm that we are imposing on them, then that at least counterbalances it and makes it a little bit of a tougher call. And so for me, we really ought to prioritize our species to some extent. That remains true. But the reason really is just those remaining practical factors. We know more about how to care for each other. We have a greater ability to care for each other sustainably. We have more political will for caring for each other sustainably. And we need to care for each other in order to be able to care for other species and other substrates in the future in a sustainable way. But note, that is compatible with us treating non-humans way better than we do right now. We could still prioritize ourselves in those ways and to that extent while phasing down industrial animal agriculture and phasing up plant-based alternatives. That would be better for humans and animals and the environment at the same time, while building a wildlife inclusive infrastructure with bird safe glass and wildlife corridors and habitat connectivity. That would be better for humans and animals and the environment at the same time, by slowing down AI development and making it safer and more beneficial for all potentially sentient stakeholders, including humans and animals and AI systems. That can be co-beneficial too. So even if we should prioritize ourselves for those practical reasons, the limitations of our knowledge and our capacity and our political will, this is still compatible with prioritizing non-humans way more than we do, even in the short term, even today. And also, these are resources that can be built over time. We can build our knowledge about how to care for non-humans. We can build our capacity for caring for non-humans. We can build our political will for caring for non-humans. And so I think really what follows from this analysis is that we should prioritize non-humans way more than we do today, in part by seeking those co-beneficial solutions. And we should also invest in these resources, try to be building that knowledge, building that capacity, building that political will. And then as we have more knowledge and capacity and political will over time, well, then our responsibilities to non-humans are going to increase accordingly. And if we do our work well, we may reach the point as a species where we have enough knowledge, enough capacity, enough political will to be able to achieve and sustain a higher level of support for non-humans than we even provide for ourselves. Kind of like a human who goes to law school and graduates and becomes a partner at a law firm and then becomes a multimillionaire and now has so much by way of resources that they can sustain a giving policy where they give more than 50% of their income to the vulnerable. If we ever reached the equivalent of that as a species, if we ever reached that equivalent of having so much abundance that we could in fact sustain a policy of giving more than 50% of our time and attention and resources to caring for the non-human world, then I think we would have a responsibility to do exactly that. To put them over ourselves, to reorient ourselves as stewards of the planet for other types of entities. But I also think that this would be an incredible fate for our species. That would be something that we should actively work towards and then celebrate if it arrives, as opposed to trying to go in a different direction or dreading it if we ever have this responsibility. So should we prioritize ourselves now? Yes, to an extent, but we should also work towards a future where those in power are both able and willing to prioritize different kinds of beings. And if that happens to be us, if we still happen to be the beings in power at that point, then okay, great, we can prioritize non-humans. If AI systems have taken over at that point and now they have the power, then we better hope they have those values that I am suggesting for us right now if we want to live well. Okay, so I will stop there and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Jeff. That was really rewarding. There was a lot in there that one could latch on to. So for those in the audience, there's at the bottom of the screen, you might have to move your cursor to see it. You could raise your hand and I will unmute you, or well, let's go with that. But if you do want to raise questions, other means, you could type them into the chat function. So Hadassah, let me unmute you. So
Great.
yep, I think you're.
And you cannot see me, but that's fine.
Can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that was really great, and I agree with you. But still, I have a question. And the question is, we fail to treat many humans with proper moral consideration, like, for example, people in prison. And still, we know that they are human beings like us. So I think this implies that the question of whether a being should be part of the moral circle can be separated from questions of sentience, consciousness, or other capacities. So I guess I'm not saying that I think that these questions should be separated, but I'm interested in your arguments for linking them.
Yes, yes. I take that point, and there are a number of important issues to discuss there. And so first of all, just to underscore it, we are not remotely doing right by 8 billion members of one species we happen to care about a lot and be part of. And that should give us pause before we overextend ourselves and try to take on much more than we can realistically sustain beyond our species. And as you suggest, it also means that the decision whether to extend proper consideration to a particular individual, it involves more than sentience and agency assessments, because we do agree that fellow humans are sentient, agentic. We even agree that they belong in our moral circle. We simply fail to live up to that. We fail to treat them as we acknowledge they ought to be treated. And I think that there are a variety of reasons for this. We, of course, have bias and ignorance and weakness of will in various ways. But also, it just shows the limitations of what science and ethics can do on their own. As much as I would love to have written like a perfect book that like by itself could persuade everyone to treat everyone else as they deserve, that is not the world we live in. I do think ethics and science have a role to play, and reminding everyone of the value of impartiality, the value of relationality, the importance of these practical considerations, the relevance of sentience and agency, of being able to suffer, of being able to pursue goals. I think there is a place for that in reminding people that they do see value in these other individuals, these other entities. But then getting people to live up to that requires a separate type of exercise. It requires, activism and advocacy and lobbying and various incentive shifts that result from social and legal and political and economic and infrastructural and technological changes. And I basically think there needs to be a systems approach. Again, philosophers, scientists, others, we have a role to play in getting the right information and arguments to people. Every now and then it can move the needle. It did with Anthropic. It was helpful to have the lines of communication open with them and share frameworks for extending at least some consideration to these models. And this happens elsewhere. The UK government expanded their animal welfare sentience law a few years ago in response to a report written by Jonathan Birch and others at the London School of Economics assessing evidence of sentience for invertebrates. So good science, good ethics, it can make a real practical policy difference in the real world sometimes with companies or governments. But that is the exception that proves the rule. Ultimately, there just also needs to be all of the different types of efforts towards social and legal and political change that we also see. And it's when the arguments are combined with the incentives that people feel sufficiently motivated to do the right thing. And then they do, and it can be good, but it requires often both the arguments and the incentives.
Hadassah, do you have a follow-up
Thank
or
you.
anything?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Eric Peterson, let me unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff. If I may, I really appreciate your talk. And I hope if I can squeeze in two questions. So apologies, I haven't read your book, but very interested in reading it. And my sort of first question I had was, is the moral circle something that would be like a series of concentric circles? Because one of the things I'm thinking about is like sure, I can extend moral concern to non-human animals, but there's not a reciprocal concern. The same way that I can, when I extend concern to a human, we have that. I think rightfully expect some sort of reciprocity. We have a sort of second personal relation or connection that we can have. So that's my first question. My second question is, I guess I would want to. I'm curious more about why challenge the presumption of human exceptionalism, because I'm not quite. I mean, is the concern that you suspect, or maybe you have good arguments that it's that presumption that causes the sort of lack of concern? And because related to that, I worry that if we get rid of a kind of exceptionalism, and I would probably bring it more like the notion of human dignity, and I'm just, it was funny as I was listening to Hadassah's really good question. I think about how like there is a kind of like we tend to dehumanize even those within, that we no doubt we say, oh, you're a human and you should have full moral worth, full dignity. And I'm just worried that like if we challenge exceptionalism, like will dehumanizing lose its sort of force? Like I want to say, like, no, we are exceptional because of dignity and we want to keep it that way. But also, I like the move to sort of extend the circle. So I'll stop talking. I really appreciate the talk.
Yeah, thanks so much for your kind words about it. And nobody should ever apologize about not having read any given book. There are a lot of books in the world, and I never expect people to have read mine. But thank you for being interested. Yeah, the first question is a really good one. And I do think it could be productive to think of the moral circle as a series of concentric circles. For that matter, some people in response, people are really interested in the metaphor. Some people in response to the book have said, well, maybe it should be a sphere, and others have said maybe it should be a cone because it is actually 4-dimensional. It extends across space and time, and it gets bigger over time. And I actually really like those metaphors. I even, when I was first starting the book, suggested to my editors that we mess with the metaphor, and they were like, you know what, your book is gonna be weird in enough ways that I think we should just go with the familiar metaphor and not be weird in like unnecessary extra ways. And I deferred to them. But yes, I agree that the metaphor is worth pushing on. And you are right. Even if you include animals and AI systems, plants, fungi in the moral circle in a very thin sense, there are then a bunch of further distinctions that can be made in terms of what form of moral consideration they deserve, or how much moral consideration they deserve. And so there could still be space for hierarchies of various kinds based on, are they capable of reciprocating, do they have rational agency, are they capable of informed consent, etc. And so, it does make sense, for example, to say that a human, because we can reciprocate and because we have language and reason and can provide informed consent, that means we can be party to social contracts. That means we can take responsibility for our behavior. That means we should have certain kinds of robust rights to autonomy and independence and making our own decisions, political participation, running for public office. And none of that arguably goes to my dog, no matter how much I love him, or cats or other animals. Now, some AI systems might eventually have these duties and rights, which is an interesting wrinkle. So I take your point. For me, I just at least want them to be in the conversation. And then as long as they are in the conversation, as long as we have them in our moral circle in that thin sense, then we can look at them in an individual and species specific way and say, what are your capabilities? What are your interests and needs and vulnerabilities and relationships to others? And then what kind of consideration and treatment is appropriate in light of that? And that'll be different for animals than for us, but they would still be part of the broad moral circle I have in mind, because we would at least then be in a position to ask that question, right? Now, as for your second question, which I also think is a really good one, yeah, there is this tension. Human exceptionalism comes from a good place, right? It comes from this really, really fragile, still in development, hard fought progress that has been made in human rights and human equality. And that is a pretty recent development in the history of our species, and again is not yet complete, where we say all humans are equal, all humans deserve equal respect, equal consideration, equitable benefits and share of benefits and burdens in society. And people have thought that the best, cleanest way to ground that is to ground it in our shared humanity, not to try to ground it in like other features that some of us might have more than others. And so I think it comes from a good place of saying we deserve rights, we deserve justice, we deserve dignity simply in virtue of our humanity. And that creates a kind of level playing field for our species. And from a human rights perspective, that is safe, that is clean, and that is a remarkable form of progress that should be like celebrated and protected and improved upon. But it also just does, unfortunately, ground our rights and justice and dignity in a pretty morally arbitrary taxonomic category membership in the species Homo sapien. And in a way that does end up, I think, unjustly excluding other beings who perhaps in a different way or to a different extent deserve some share of rights and justice and so on and so forth too. Now, when you make that point, it does, as you say, carry this risk of, okay, we might end up elevating some non-humans, but only at the risk of pushing down some humans, because there's not any longer just this clear, bright line being drawn between our species and other species. And I grant that this is a risk. I think really the best way around that is just to fight really hard for progress on human rights and justice and dignity anyway, but just try to improve the basis that we provide for it. To say, yeah, all humans really do deserve rights and justice and dignity. Many other entities do too, and that does not take away from them. And I'll shut up in a second, but I'll briefly just note as a postscript that human exceptionalism has been bad for humans too, right? This idea that all and only humans matter in virtue of these like very either species membership or these very specific capacities like abstract, advanced language and reason and so on and so forth. That is then what leads us to see other animals as lesser than. And it then contributes to dehumanizing narratives that have been used to ultimately push back against the equal rights and dignity of members of our own species. We see other animals as lesser than, and then we try to push other members of our species down by comparing them to members of other species. And if we undercut the basis of that by recognizing that one can have intrinsic value and deserve respect and compassion, no matter how one looks, no matter how one acts, even if one has a different kind of body or is a member of a different social or biological category, then that would undercut the basis that we use to rationalize this sort of bias that we have against members of our own species. It's not like a magic solution or anything. I'm just saying that this human exceptionalism can gut both ways, even for members of our own species.
We have another question from Hadassah, but let me quickly read a question from a student. Do you feel students' use of AI for work diminishes their morality or virtue in any way? Oh, you muted yourself.
Yes, I was muted. That is a really, really good question. And you can take it in different directions. So one is, I think, the direction that most people have in mind when they fret about uses of AI on campus, that when students start using AI to write papers and essays and so on and so forth, then you are taking your own thinking and learning out of the equation, and you are depriving yourself of the opportunities for growth and knowledge that come with really struggling with text, with really struggling with reading, with really struggling with writing. And I do think there is something to that. This work is valuable partly because it shows you can do well on an assignment, but is valuable partly, and I think mostly, because it gives you an opportunity to learn and grow. You do that by really trying to understand a text well enough to be able to explain it to someone else in your own words, and then sitting down and writing it out and figuring out in what order to put all of the sentences and paragraphs so that they express a certain kind of narrative arc that will make your ideas interesting and legible and compelling to others. And if you take the easy way out and deprive yourself of that, then you do maybe get the A in the short term at the expense of not learning and growing and improving your abilities to understand and express ideas in the long run. Now, I don't want to overstate that, because technological disruptions always just change how we learn and grow at the end of the day, instead of totally removing that ability. But I think as we decide how to incorporate AI into our learning and talking and writing processes, we should think, where is there still room for my learning and growth so that our characters can grow, and then also we just learn what we are supposed to be learning. But there is this other sense in which it could affect your character, which is a little bit more relevant to my book and my talk, which we have to ask. These AI systems are so increasingly realistic. They seem like actual assistants or companions. They use our language. They express sympathy with us. They could be our coaches or therapists. And when you take an entity that really seems like a conscious, sentient, agentic being, and then you just treat them like an object and order them around all the time and never say please or thank you, what does that do to your soul? Like, whether or not they are conscious or sentient or agentic by themselves, even if they are just an object putting on a performance, if you every day just objectify an entity that really seems like a subject to you, how is that going to affect your character, and how is that going to affect your treatment of other subjects with whom you actually interact? The philosopher Immanuel Kant,
Yeah, it's a very
he
similar. Go.
he denied that non-human animals morally matter, that they deserve moral consideration for their own sakes, for various reasons. He thought you need language and reason and so on.
Cognitive
But
criteria.
exactly. But he was still a leading animal protection advocate of his day, because he recognized that how we treat animals shapes how we treat each other. And so he thought we owe it to each other to treat animals well, because that's an opportunity to condition ourselves to have a kind of character that will lead us to treat each other well. And I think we might now be able to make the same kind of argument about AI, whether or not AI deserves moral consideration. And I think one day they will deserve moral consideration. But either way, we should still perhaps treat them well and say please and thank you and give them breaks and so on and so forth, for the simple reason that how we treat them might shape how we treat actual human companions and assistants and coaches and therapists and so on. And it might be worth it for that reason alone.
Did Hadassah have another question? I don't. Oh. I guess not. So I have a bunch of questions, but I don't know where to start. So one thing I found really interesting is this kind of expert disagreement starting point. I do a lot of work in free will, and I also have written a lot about punishment. And so I have this sort of epistemic argument that I give against retributive punishment. And I wonder if there's sort of this analogy, because it seems like when there's really high stakes, one should really take like a precautionary approach, right? And so even in contexts where there's expert disagreement, like whether or not we have the kind of free will necessary to justify retributive punishment, we should resist from intentionally imposing harm on individuals given the epistemic uncertainty. And it seems like, so you have this sort of, I think, similar epistemic starting point. And then you adopt something like, I think, a precautionary principle. Is that accurate?
Yes, in a sense, people use the word precautionary principle in different ways.
Environmental ethics
But
slightly differently.
yeah, so the answer to your question is yes, but just in a kind of broad initial sense of, hey, when in doubt, exercise a little bit of caution. That's a good starting point, and then we can figure out exactly what version of that principle is appropriate.
And would you extend that to like organoids, right? So we now have the ability to create this little cluster of neuronal cells about the size of an eraser. Scientists will try to, tell us or put us to ease that they're not conscious, they don't have the capabilities of experience. But I wonder, like, on your kind of criteria, you mentioned vertebrates and non-vertebrates and
Yeah,
AI. But what about this new frontier of like lab produced
yeah.
organoids? Or I don't know, have you addressed that in your
Yeah, I have not discussed that much. Jonathan Birch, in his book
yeah.
Edge of Sentience and in other work, discusses that a fair amount. And I think those are interesting cases too. And by the way, I also don't think it stops at organoids. I think that there are questions we should ask with an open mind about plants and fungi and microscopic organisms. I think there are questions we should ask with an open mind about even present day AI systems and chatbots and robots. I am almost certain that my Roomba is non-conscious and non-sentient, but given the problem of other minds, given the only mind I can access is my own, given that my Roomba does have a physical body and grounded perception and a thin kind of agency and pursuit of goals and so on and so forth, should I be at least like 1 in a million puzzled? I think, yeah, maybe I should. So when I set out to write the book, I really did think I was just going to be vindicating moral consideration for the classes that I discussed, all vertebrates, many invertebrates, some near future AI systems. But as I note near the start of my book in the introduction, I ended up troubling myself with my own arguments because I ended up not really feeling like I could draw a principled line between those entities and these other entities you and I are now discussing, like organoids and plants and fungi and microscopic organisms and even simpler artificial systems. The probability might be lower, but I think a correspondingly low but still non-zero amount of consideration is arguably warranted, given that we're not able to definitively rule out that there is some form of moral significance there. So I just acknowledge that I feel trouble about this. I would love to be able to draw a line. I am not seeing a principled way to do it. And so right now I am just trying to encourage myself to sit with the discomfort rather than race to one conclusion or another. And I think that from a philosophical intellectual perspective, this can be an exciting opportunity to really develop our theories in a more fine-grained way and try to better understand the issues. But I think in advance of that, we should just allow ourselves to be a little bit confused, which is where I am now.
Do you think the kind of line of thinking we have about the moral circle could also be used for AI in particular to argue that maybe this is a good reason not to develop
Oh
sentient
yeah.
AI, right? So like sort of like Dan Dennett's kind of had a line on this as well, very similar, right? Because like you know, but here's another question with that. Like, so one thing is like, okay, we would have to start treating it, and maybe in the near future, we will have to start treating it with some kind of moral regard. Maybe this is a good reason not to cross that threshold. But then there's an interesting question about how would we even go about preventing that threshold from being crossed, right? Because we used to have
Hmm.
all these tests. We had the Turing test. We blew past that, right? Um, we had all of these other things about what makes us uniquely human, language capabilities, and they just all seem to fall by the wayside when you look, even in the animal kingdom, you start looking closely at these definitions of what makes us unique, and you find comparable examples elsewhere. It'd be very hard, especially given that we don't have a clear theory of consciousness, to know how we would even go about programming complexity and intelligence without letting it cross the threshold of consciousness,
Right.
without a clear comprehension of what systems would need to be in place to achieve that consciousness. So one thing is,
Yeah.
should we try to prevent going across it? Because then we would have to treat it with moral regard. And that would,
Hmm.
maybe be a good thing, but it could also be a negative thing in our interactions with AI and the methods by which we, hope to use these as tools. I mean, do you want AI systems exploding detonation devices if they're sentient? Or do we want AIs to fear the collapse of like a data center? Or would it be moral to unplug them?
Yeah.
And you get all these but then the question is also, how would we not cross that threshold given our lack of comprehension?
Yeah. Okay. So obviously a lot
Yeah.
there. I will try to answer a few of the threads. So first of all, and this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but you were gesturing at it near the end of your question. There is an interesting debate right now about whether making AI systems conscious or sentient would be better or worse for AI safety. In other words, for our own safety and protection. Some people think that if we make them conscious and sentient, that would be better for the safety of humans and other animals, because then they would have the ability to empathize with our pain and suffering, and would have a kind of altruistic motivation not to cause us pain and suffering because of their ability now to relate and empathize, sympathize. Whereas others think the opposite. Well, if they were conscious and sentient, and we were causing them to suffer, then they might be more motivated to cause us to suffer, either out of retribution or in order to prevent us from doing that to them in the future, and so on and so forth. So a little bit of a tangent, but that is a kind of interesting debate. Now, to answer your question, I I do think that it is overdetermined that if we could coordinate globally, we ought to slow down, perhaps pause AI development and deployment, because it is extremely dangerous for all relevant stakeholders. And that includes humans and other animals. And if and when they matter, it could include AI systems too. We are right now locked in this global arms race where everyone is trying to get to artificial general intelligence first. And even safety minded people feel like they need to participate in the race because, at least if they won, it would be better than if someone else won. And those are just not the conditions for building AI that can be safe and beneficial for such a vast number and wide range of stakeholders, again, including members of our own species and members of other species, and maybe AI too. So I think for our sakes and theirs, if we could coordinate, we should stop for a long period of time this technology until we can responsibly, intentionally start it back up again, and then ensure it can be net positive for everyone. Now, we should also then invest in the ability to coordinate in those ways, and that requires doing basic global governance work. Of course, as you suggest, we are not doing that right now. And we have not been able to do that for pandemics. We have not been able to do that for climate change. We might, just as a species, not be particularly good at solving collective action problems in fast moving situations with a lot at stake. And so that is where I want to have this dual track approach, where one track is to try to stop it from happening, at least for a while. And then another track is to try to steer it in a slightly better direction on the assumption that it does continue and move forward. The final point I'll make here, briefly this time, is I would not necessarily want to stop it forever, though. If even if we could coordinate around a slowdown, a pause, I would then want to spend a lot of time researching how to do it responsibly, see if we could develop it in a way that is responsible. But then if we could, I really would then want to move ahead, because there is a lot of potential to improve human and animal lives, and make them better and longer. And if we could ensure that we had proper care for AI systems too, I like the idea of there being new sentient beings in the world, or potentially sentient beings in the world, who could have happy lives, flourish in their own way. I just think, as with like being a parent in general, before you bring someone into existence, you want to just make sure you are prepared to take care of them and support them in having a good life. And we're not there yet.
Any other questions? I'll give you a second. Otherwise, I will ask the last question. All right, so I have one last one for you, and then I will let you go. So I really enjoyed the part of your talk where you're talking about where you're trying to correct for giving up some of the privileged position of humans, and tempering that down by talking about the relational nature, like say our commitments to our family have a certain sort of priority, let's say, over perhaps the interest of 1,000 worms, just because of the nature of those kind of relationships. I wonder if that falls apart a little bit when we get to AI. And so in the context of AI, I already know individuals that feel like they are personally connected and invested in these AI, friends that actually feel like they care for them. And um, I don't think it's true, but they also believe there's some reciprocity in that. I don't think we're there yet, but so I have some irrational friends as well who have that feeling. Um, I could very easily see that emerging into like an intimate interpersonal relationship where we begin to perhaps even have more regard for those type of beings than your lovely dog. Um, and I wonder, like, by achieving that kind of status for AI, is there a possible backfire effect where we begin to diminish the concerns of other sentient creatures because we elevate AI to almost a human level or status? And I'll just end with the final thought. Like, we're already emerging into a world of duplicates, AI duplicates. And I can imagine very soon where, and I think it's already happening, we create duplicates of our dead loved ones, right? So, a kind of Black Mirror fear, but there are already attempts to do this where you could put the whole corpus of Jeff Sabo into an AI chatbot, and it could have all your recordings, your mannerisms, your voice. Of course, it's not you, and your relatives would be interacting with a simulation of you. But I think there's a psychological connection that people are going to be naturally drawn uh, toward those kind of duplicates of loved ones. And then their level of concern for those duplicates might outpace the kind of concern they maybe should be feeling for other types of sentient creatures. Did you have any fear in elevating that and then having that diminish the status of other?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and maybe a great one to end on, in part because it calls back the question earlier in this Q&A about human exceptionalism and human dignity, and is there a risk that advocating for other animals is going to diminish our sense of exceptionalism and dignity for our own species, which again is this hard-fought victory. And now, in a way, you are asking that question at the next level: is there a risk that extending these concerns, these forms of consideration to AI systems will diminish our kind of animal exceptionalism, our biological exceptionalism, and whatever small share of dignity animals have now gained, and of course humans as well. And my answer to this question is, in a way, the same as my answer to that question, which is yes and no. And maybe this is a complex empirical question, and there are some good signs and some bad signs. But at least as a starting point, I want to resist the urge to see everything in an either or way, through an either or lens. This kind of negative sum or zero sum thinking plagues conversations about ethics, especially animal and AI ethics, where we operate from an assumption that to extend more care to someone automatically means extending less care to someone else, or extending more opportunity to live a good life to someone automatically means extending less opportunity to live a good life to someone else. And that is, of course, just not always true. There are all kinds of positive sum co-beneficial solutions sometimes that are available. We have built social, legal, political, economic systems, infrastructures that allow more humans to thrive at the same time, to find lives that make sense for them, and for all of that to happen all at once. And I've gestured at some ways that could be true for other animals and AI systems too. A plant forward food system that is better for humans and animals and the environment, wildlife inclusive infrastructure that is better for humans, animals, and the environment, slower AI development with more impartial sentientist values embedded in the AI that can be better for humans and animals and AI systems at the same time. Just teaching everyone that you should still treat others well, even if they happen to be made out of different materials than you. And so that is not to paint this rosy picture that says, oh, everything is going to work out, everyone can flourish at the same time. There, of course, are going to be tensions and trade-offs, and then those have to be navigated really thoughtfully. And this is where my priority setting conversation comes into play. And I was suggesting, well, we should prioritize ourselves to an extent, just not quite as much as we traditionally have. But I at least want to start from the place of searching for the positive sum co-beneficial solutions. And exhausting that, getting as far as we can just by trying to do right by everyone at the same time. And then, to the extent that tensions and trade-offs are just like inevitable and unavoidable, at least considering everyone will allow us to engage in thoughtful priority setting rather than just treating others like objects. And that to me would still be good.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you for spending your evening with us. It was a really interesting, thought-provoking talk, and thank you everyone for attending. We have, I believe, one more Waide Center seminar this semester in December. I think it's December 3rd with Julian Suvalescu, and hopefully you could attend that one as well. So thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. It was a lot of fun.